Okay, Dan, welcome back. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Two Words Podcast, the podcast where we talk at the intersection of business, technology, finance, you name it. We're just two dudes working and living in London. And this is now the fourth episode. Dan, how are you feeling? How are you feeling today?
I'm good, Juan. I've had a good day at work. It's a good day for me. I'm excited for our conversation today. I think our audience would also be very interested in what we have to say about some of the exciting topics that we're passionate about. How about you, Juan? How's everything in your end? Once again, you are on the move.
Yeah, I think, I always get the feeling that you are always in the same setting. I'm always changing setting. It's just how it is. Management consulting life. This time, actually, not so much because of work, but because of leisure. I'm back hitting the slopes tomorrow again. So yeah, that's good. Also looking forward to our conversation today. I think, one of the things that I feared when we decided to start the podcast, I said, we are discussing topics about news that happen every day, technology, finance, etc. And we do this weekly. So my fear was, is there going to be something to discuss every week? Or is there just going to be a quiet week? Well, last week certainly wasn't one of those quiet weeks. There's been so much going on every single aspect that we want to touch on. And why don't we dive straight in? Trump got elected last week. Yeah, it was last week, right? I don't
Yes.
know. I don't know what day I live in anymore. Exactly. So Trump was elected last week, and there were a bunch of executive orders already signed. It's clear that he's come with a mandate. Let's not talk about all of those. We are not a politics podcast or anything like that. But there was one specific topic that we do want to touch on today, and that is AI. And why don't we start there? Because there's been a lot. There's a lot to talk today
Absolutely.
with all that's been happening recently with DeepSeek, the massive tech sell-off that has gone on in capital markets, Nvidia down 17% a few days ago, Trump starting this new project Stargate as well, and all the investment that he's promised that is going to go into that. Let's get into some of that. Yeah, Dan, why don't you get us started here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Juan, I think the DeepSeek conversation is a really exciting one. I think it really comes nicely off the back of actually Stargate. And I think before we get into, that discussion, I think it's really important we explain a bit what Stargate is for the audience, because like AI, people love buzzwords, but maybe we should give a bit more of background. So Stargate is a project about basically an AI joint venture, and it's between OpenAI, SoftBank, Oracle, and MGX, and it was announced on January the 1st, so quite recently, and it really focuses on developing AI infrastructure across the US. Its expected investment is 500 billion US dollars, an astonishing amount of money by 2029. And initially, they're going to put 100 billion down, right, to deploy it. The focus of it is to focus on high performance computing, which means effectively AI model development and data centers and everything associated with that. It is not focused on chip manufacturing. And I think that there is a really important distinction for our audience, and we can break that down a bit further. So Stargate is not a semiconductor manufacturing project. What I mean by that is it's not a Nvidia, it isn't a Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing corporation, the TSMC. It is focusing on building large-scale AI data centers to support next-gen AI models, which in theory, based on the analysis, will require massive storage facilities for GPUs. And originally, the first site is going to be in Abilene, Texas, and then we'll expand from there. And it will need a huge amount of natural dedicated gas power. So that's also a huge part of that initial 100 billion that they're spending. And then Oracle and OpenAI will use those data centers for model training and cloud AI. Now, the reason this is really important for AI is that we've actually hit the computing capacity limits. So for OpenAI, Microsoft, and Google. So the idea here is to actually build a facility that these massive corporations can share and use to actually carry on to develop. However, AI companies are still facing 6-month delays for GPU access. The huge amounts of supply constraints. So that's a very different problem that Stargate isn't addressing. But there are other projects in place to focus on those AI, hardware pieces and the manufacturing of those GPUs. So, for example, the US has a CHIPS Act spending $52 billion in semiconductor production. Intel has invested $100 billion into an Ohio chip fabrication. So a lot of these things coming into the US rather than relying so much on Taiwan. And even TSMC, which is Taiwanese based, is expanding into Arizona. So it'll be a great focus on being able to break the computing bottleneck in terms of being able to train these GPT-5s, the AGI models, which are expected to require 10 or 100 times more computing power than we currently have. And they cost a huge amount. So that's why this is such a big deal.
That is according to the scaling laws that
exactly
with every order of magnitude increment in training and compute, essentially in training cost for a company, as you scale the model and the models get larger, then that essentially results in potentially not an order of magnitude, but a significant increase in intelligence. So let's say an X increase in training cost or the next increase in the size of the model results in a model going from undergraduate level intelligence to PhD level intelligence. Is this right?
Yes. So that is why I wanted to start with that. And I think it's really important to highlight that all of these numbers, all of these assumptions have that sort of breakdown and a fundamental assumption base that we need so much more resources, so much more capability to carry on with this technology. And that's where DeepSeek comes in. And I think, so we can, come back to this, but I think really focusing on really understanding, first of all, why Stargate is important is great. Then you can start questioning, where is this 500 billion? Is it realistic? We've seen similar projects in the past in terms of a much smaller size. So just doing a quick spending breakdown, it does make sense in terms of what is currently being planned based on the information they had at that moment in time. However, a lot of the questions are now coming up with an ability to produce a much more powerful, or I'll let you speak more about it, Juan, model using DeepSeek. So that is why I wanted to lay the foundations of what Stargate is all about. But the question is really, is it a huge waste of money or really, really great?
Yeah, and so I haven't gotten into the details of exactly what Stargate entails. I've read all the headlines like everyone has. I just know that Trump is someone that, the bigger the number, the better, because he's a businessman and he understands numbers. And if someone says that they're going to invest into AI infrastructure build out, then if Trump can put his name behind that, it has a certain effect. Now, there are questions also with the financing of the 500 billion. Who is going to be behind? Who is essentially going to put up 500 billion to fund this? Yeah, if you have some color there, I personally, yes, I'm not too concerned about that. I think if you're able to demonstrate that there's an ROI on the 500 billion, then you should be able to get the funding. The question is, with what has been coming up in the market this week, and essentially with the DeepSeek model that we will talk about now, the question is springing up, will there be a market that is big enough to make a return on 500 billion, or are we just spending at a rate that doesn't make sense?
Yeah. So, I think to give a little more of a breakdown, right? Because the return on investment differs on basically what your proposal is. So 500 billion isn't going to be a single data point. You can break it down into four main areas, which are 250 billion roughly is expected to be spent on AI data centers and compute power, 100 billion on around energy infrastructure, so this plant, so that might have a clearer, return on investment. Then you have AI model training and research, 75 billion, so the facilities to do that. And then a workforce and expansion focus, which would be 75 billion. Now, we've seen that SoftBank and OpenAI have both committed 19 billion. So that means that of that initial 100 billion, we've got, 38 billion covered, so 62 billion is missing. But the question is then who will also cover that additional 400 billion? And there has been no government funding confirmed yet, despite Trump's announcement. But we are seeing speculation around private investors, especially VCs and tech giants, and that these will step in. Of course, I agree with you, Juan. I think these questions are unanswered. It is not clear how such an expensive project and just throwing money at it will solve some problems. And if anything that we've learned from DeepSeek, which we'll get into, is that maybe it's not, we got to question these numbers, because finance, and I know this from my work, it's not just how much money you throw at something, it's also the quality of your spending. It's the quality of the research. It's the quality of the infrastructure you're building, the efficiencies. How much of it is lost in paying people high salaries rather than focusing on fundamental, breakthrough technology? That's not clear.
And Dan, do you know what this reminds me of? So for anyone listening, I'm an aerospace engineer by training, but I work as a management consultant for, specifically, we do a lot of work in the private equity niche. And this really reminds me of the 2018 time in private equity, where whenever there's a bubble, there's sort of buzz that people live in. Everyone gets the fear of missing out and just starts throwing money no matter the valuations. And that was a bit what happened in the private equity and the VC world a few years ago, where companies were investing at really inflated valuations. And then fast forward to today, but starting a few years ago, we saw that the whole industry went into a sort of a stalemate, where you had these companies that had a lot of money, a lot of dry powder at all-time highs, and then all of these companies that were trapped in a stalemate of valuations, where the companies had bought at too high a valuation, expecting really immense growth, and in a sense they were thinking valuation doesn't matter, because if I invest in a company at a valuation of 2 million or 5 million, why does it matter? Because in 3 years' time, it's going to be worth 15 million. So let's just get the upside. And now you're trapped with those really high valuations. So companies or the funds are not able to let go of all of those assets in the standard holding periods that these VCs and private equity firms typically have. So it's something similar here, I think, that's happened with this AI. I'm going to call it a bubble just because of what I'm about to explain, which is I think there's a similar dynamic that has gone on in here, where you have all of these companies and all of these capital allocators that really didn't want to miss out on the AI era and the AI buzz, and they decided to throw a lot of money into building out the infrastructure. There's been trillions of money, trillions of dollars invested into building out AI infrastructure, building out the hardware layer, building out the foundational models, billions of dollars to train these LLMs. And now you are seeing how a Chinese company with very little funding and now we can get into some of that later, can essentially clone your model that you have spent. And when I say you, I mean OpenAI, or I mean the United States. You've spent a lot of money building that infrastructure layer, building that model out, spending all of this money on inference compute, on cloud compute, on training cost. And then it turns out that someone gets in from your back door and essentially steals all of that intelligence and is able to get at a very similar level of intelligence with reportedly between 5 and 6 million, not billion, million, right? So
amazing. Wow. Right.
Yeah, no, it's really amazing. And so maybe should we get into what has happened? Because I understand a lot of our listeners may not know what has been going on with the whole DeepSeek model. It's been everywhere, so it's quite likely that whoever's listening has heard about DeepSeek by now. But I think there's been a narrative that has been pushed out that is not entirely true. And I want to make sure that we get clear things out and get the facts out.
Absolutely. Go for it, Juan, I think.
Okay, so let's start from the beginning. What is DeepSeek? And why is it such a great deal? So essentially, DeepSeek is an AI model created by a Chinese AI startup. And the reason it has caused such a massive reaction from politically, but also in the capital markets, and specifically with Nvidia, which saw a 17% fall on it wasn't even the day of the release, but the day that it was being picked up. That's, again, 17% off Nvidia's market cap is around 600 billion. So in market value. So, it's we are talking about a big event that has happened here. Now, the reason why there's been set the tech world into a frenzy is because DeepSeek was able to demonstrate very similar performance to OpenAI's latest models like ChatGPT 4.0 and even a reasoning model like o1 that it offered entirely for free and open source. Not only that, it's much more efficient. It is trained. The real breakthrough is how it's been trained and fine-tuned, and we'll get into some of that. But it's essentially a model that is very similar in performance to the OpenAI's, Anthropic's, Google Gemini's of the world, that runs on much less power, open source, and you can literally download it and it can run on your computer. Now the question then arises, how can an AI startup with 5 to 6 million train a model that is as good as the US companies that have spent all of these billions of dollars in building out the entire AI infrastructure? And the reason is that it is not entirely as it may seem, and as the media may have portrayed that it had done it. Essentially, it is pretty much accepted by now that the method that DeepSeek used to train its model was by distilling OpenAI's output. So essentially, they found, like the Chinese always do, a very good and effective and efficient way of replicating and cloning a large language model like OpenAI, ChatGPT, let's call it a parent model, that they could then scrape that model for its training data and get a distilled form of the data to then run their own model. And then there are some advancements in the fine-tuning and the training methodologies that they used, with the only difference that this time the breakthrough comes from a Chinese company instead of a US company. However, that doesn't mean that we are going to see a decrease in the requirements for compute and build out to train even larger models and more intelligent models. It just means that there's been a way that has been found to be able to reach the same level of performance without needing to train on proprietary data, essentially. And that is the real breakthrough. Now, the key challenge now becomes, is it possible to train a parent model and then use the parent model's output to train another model like DeepSeek that is much more efficient, but then use that and combined with the models that are existing to train even more intelligent models? Because then you escape the scaling law and essentially you have found a way to build more intelligence without needing to increase the size of your models and increase the cost requirements. And that there's questions as to if that is possible or not. Again, I'm not an expert, but I think that is where this conversation is going. And then there are other questions that are then raised on, is it legit that a company can do that? Can a company just go to the US market and start to monetize? Again, you must remember that DeepSeek is now the #1 downloaded app on the App Store. Is it okay for a Chinese company to go and commercialize a model that it has essentially scraped, stolen, you name it, let's not classify it now, on the US market? So it puts a lot of questions on the US export restrictions that now may start to take place. With AI, it's just very complicated because even the data that was used to train the parent models, can it be called proprietary data? So what is going to be the US's response? Is the 500 billion necessary anymore? Right? All of those questions are now being launched, and with a government that is focusing on cost cutting with Doge, now this comes along, the rivalry between Elon Musk and Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. Are we really going to see the US invest 500 billion with a B when a Chinese company can essentially create a model for 5 or 6 million with an M that reaches the same level of performance as OpenAI? Yeah, that is what's happening at the moment. Just to put a final reflection on this. I don't know you, Dan, but this week in particular accentuated my view that we really have to get our stuff together in Europe. Because while the US and China are battling it out for trying to see who is going to be the dominant player in the AI era, here we are in Europe with our stupid bottles with these lids that don't detach from the bottle and just, yeah. Is that really the focus of Europe? Where is Europe in all of this? We are, in my opinion, just falling behind quite narrowly, and we have to get it together, seriously.
Yeah, Juan, I think a really good thing that I think of when it comes to these things is another analogy. So I really liked your analogy earlier. And I think, you were talking about the private equity space and how similar it is. Now, I also think that there's an element, because that's more focused on the private sector and the return on investment. But, if we're taking a European perspective, we can think of it more as a governmental role. And it reminds me a lot of actually the space race and the space race we've seen. And there are two reasons for that. The first is, this emotional response of we need to beat the Chinese, the US back in the day, or Russia. And it's a similar sort of concept about let's just throw money at something to try and beat them. But of course, there's more to it than meets the eye, right? What are some of the reasons that the space race was so important? It was about actually controlling environments outside the world, right? In terms of the Earth as a planet, which meant even military advantages, right? The nuclear race and so much more that came out of that in terms of nuclear warheads. So to me, in terms of why are governments so focused on throwing money at things, and we haven't seen any commitment from the US government as a whole on this project. But one reason they might throw money at this is because of the fact that they're trying to get a military advantage, right? Having the most advanced AI models in the world would mean that you are military-wise by far the most advanced nation on this planet, right?
And in a sense as well, the only thing that they can really do from the government's perspective is to throw money at it.
Exactly.
What else could they do?
Exactly.
And I only can think of one other thing, which is to put even tighter export control regulations on Nvidia chips. There's a question, obviously, it's being said that DeepSeek managed to get their hands on a bunch of H100s, which are the most advanced chips from Nvidia. It raises, so what can the government do? They can throw money at it and they can tighten export controls. But apart from that, I don't think there's much that you can do.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, double down on education, I guess. But I mean, other than that, really, and that's a rather trivial point in terms of actually making a huge amount of progress in this field. The reason I wanted to, finish that analogy with the space race was because actually Europe actually falls into a very similar category. And what I mean by that is Europe has been involved in the space race, and we've had the European Space Agency and various European initiatives, but it's always been kind of stuck in the middle, right? It's always followed the crowd. It's never properly stuck out. It's always been in cooperation. It's always used, American different rocket systems and, played a rather small part in terms of, even from a military perspective, try to stay quiet and focus more on things like experimental research and making the world a better place. And in terms of this competitive sort of dynamic, I think the AI world applies here because Europe will continue to mess around and play around and think it's great in terms of its AI developments and little projects, but it will never be bold and take those steps forwards or the first steps of the moon. And that's a real concern because that really just continues. I saw a Bloomberg opinion article earlier this week. Literally, the US is now a third larger than Europe. That is a huge gap, and it continues to widen as we've covered before. And this is just a big worry area because it is the new space race. It is the forefront of technology.
The key problem with Europe, apart from regulation and us focusing on, like I said, doing these bottle caps that don't separate from the bottles, there's a couple of points that play in here, and one is certainly hyper-regulation. We need to get rid of layers of regulation, and it is tied to my second point, which is decentralization, which obviously makes things much, much more difficult because in Europe is really fragmented, and every single country has its own protocols, its own rules, its own regulations. And even, I'm Spanish, I come from a country where the decision-making power within Spain is also decentralized to a number of, let's call them counties, right? So, and then the decision-making power from there goes to the towns and the town halls. And so you have layers upon layers upon layers of regulation and bureaucracy, and then you get to the country level, and then you even have to go to the European Union that literally employs thousands of people to focus on putting up regulations. But as far as I understand, there is no one in the European Union that focuses on taking out regulations. That is the missing piece, right? And this is what the US is really focusing on. But it is going to keep being hard for Europe, at least for a while. And the only project that now springs to mind that was really led by Europeans was actually the Concorde. The Concorde was developed by an alliance between France and the United Kingdom. And there's actually news on that. We can touch on it in a bit. There's been a new company that has broken the sound barrier, actually. So it does seem like supersonic flight is returning. And it's being brought back by an American company this time. So it just plays to this analogy. But yeah, there's a lot to learn from this race.
Yeah, I think so. I know that we have one company in Europe that produces the chip manufacturing machines based in the Netherlands.
Right, yeah.
Which are then used in Taiwan. But other than that, right, really, it's not just AI, right? AI is the nice fancy buzzword that we all love to talk about because it's super exciting and fundamentally going to change our generation and the generations behind us in ways we can't even imagine yet. But even just fundamental small things, small things, normal sort of development in the right direction. We've got sensors on cars and cameras on cars, and now in the US, self-driving cars as a result, right? The overregulation there as one example, but there's so many other areas, the overregulation of foods and imports and exports right? The UK having bans on certain products coming from the European Union and vice versa in terms of, let's say, meat. These are not the sorts of things you have in the US, despite the size of the US and its states being the equivalent size of Europe as a whole, right? I think despite the US having a decentralized approach as well to many of these policies and senators representing states and the local governments representing their interests, they still operate as one massive United States of America. And I think that's really key, right? It is not the United Countries of Europe, it is just Europe and the European Union, which is a very different wording and reality. And I think it's really captured even just in the names.
It's the not so happy countries in Europe that don't want to belong to the European Union. So it's even worse.
Yeah, exactly. And
we should bring a movement that is called the United States of Europe. That would be cool.
That would be very interesting.
The reality, though, is it doesn't look good. I mean, just historically and just looking and thinking from first principles, Europe is a very complex market. Because I go back to what I said, you have a bunch of countries, and even though we are quite close, I'm not sure how big Europe is compared even to the state of Texas, but it's probably around the same size. And the reality is that Europe, in that same surface area, you've got dozens of languages. So it's just ingrained in the continent's history.
Yeah,
but we do need to find a way to solve this, because otherwise we're just going to sit on the sidelines and see how the United States and China and Russia and whoever comes next just beats us in every single game. And there's not one single $1 trillion company in Europe. Not one. But not only that, I read a stat the other day, please fact check me here, but it was something along the lines of there hasn't been a company that is more than $100 billion in market cap or more created in Europe in the last, let's say, 10, 20 years, which just goes to show we have really relaxed over the past decade or so.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that comes down to history is like you said, Juan, absolutely. It's super fragmented in terms of so many different cultures in such a small population, so many different, even geographies, and just all sorts of histories and wars and things that bring people together, things that pull them apart across such a small continent. So much history of fighting with two world wars, with colonization, and how that deep-rootedly can actually break even regions of one country into various segments, you know, East-West Germany, if we're talking about Spain, but the Catalans versus the rest of Spain. And there's so many more, countless examples. The north-south divide in England, you know, there's so many, or even within the UK, just Scotland, Wales, and England all hating each other. So there's so many things that actually are deep-rooted issues that, from a social perspective, need to be overcome. But if we could get over that and take less of a protectionist perspective in terms of just keeping things the same and not taking any risk, then we would have a much better economy, a much more thriving, innovative, entrepreneurial environment, which would hopefully create these massive businesses rather than, you know, very large companies which have been around for hundreds of years, who fundamentally provide a lot of the important, basic or second, tertiary needs that we need, but rather than technological disruption. I do agree with those points. I think it's not an easy one to solve, but it is very necessary, and it's something that should be a huge focus of the European Union.
Yeah.
The EU.
Yeah, and Dan, let me just put a final point on this before we move on. We have other very exciting topics to cover. I come from a country that was conquered by the Arabs and the Muslim world back, hundreds of years ago. And the reason why they were able to conquer us so easily, they've conquered us several times in the past. Spain has been occupied by the Arabs at several moments in history. But one of those moments was precisely because the Spanish were so divided that they decided to go from a state to what was called the taifas, which essentially was the separation of the Spanish state into, I think it was like 40 or 50 separate mini countries, that then the Arabs just took advantage of that, and no one had a military, essentially. Or no one had a military with the might to put a fight against a unified country or a unified empire. And I just fear that this is happening over and over again, and that we just need to put our differences aside and really unite as a continent and find a way to live together and to utilize our scale, because otherwise it's just massively inefficient. I work in consulting. I work in organizational effectiveness, and I cannot tell you how many times we've seen companies that, precisely because they have these siloed functions across the organization, they just duplicate efforts and they create these massive inefficiencies. And then you create these layers of bureaucracy. It's just inefficiency layer after inefficiency layer. So let's switch topic, because I feel this is going into a dark spiral, and there's actually very exciting news to cover. Let me just touch on the Concorde just very briefly, Dan, on this project with Boom Supersonic, which is the company that is bringing back supersonic flight. Now, the reality is that after the Concorde, there had been a really incredible trend towards more efficient and slower flight. And that's why we saw aircraft like the A380s of the world, like the all of the recent aircraft that we have seen, that just have these massive engines that just increase the bypass ratio of the compressor, which essentially makes the engine much more efficient, but it makes the plane a lot slower. But there was a realization among the public that people prefer to fly slower rather than to have to pay thousands of dollars. And some people actually mistakenly think that the Concorde failed because it was not a safe aircraft and because it had all of these accidents. But the reality is that the Concorde's rise and fall was always underlined by its fundamental economics. It just wasn't an economically viable plane. And that's why it was decommissioned and why the project was stopped. And now we are seeing a company that has really taken a bold initiative to say, hey, we think now is the perfect timing. Let's make a plane that is capable of flying supersonic, but that is also economically viable. And so that is what we have seen now. And essentially, all this buzz is because Boom's airplane, the X-1B demonstrator plane, so not the actual plane that they will produce and that already has hundreds of orders from airlines, but the demonstrator plane broke the sound barrier with the first civilian aircraft since the Concorde. So yeah,
it's amazing, isn't it?
It's great news. Dan, would you ever fly on a supersonic flight to, let's say, London to New York?
Absolutely.
But for the caveat, at normal airfare for a flight from London to New York, maybe 400, 500 euros, pounds, dollars, whatever. Would you be willing to pay the same as a business class ticket? Like, let's say, in the thousands, so orders of magnitude greater, just to fly supersonic?
So I think that's a really interesting point, Juan. Personally, absolutely, but I think it's more as an experience more than anything. I know that, one of the things is also people would prefer feeling like they're getting more value for money. So you kind of touched on it, right? So in terms of an A380, takes much longer, but if you're spending a lot of money on the flight, at least you feel like you're getting your money's worth. I also really like that fact about the Concorde. It was actually the economics that really stopped it from being used in production. And for those who don't know, actually the A380 is going through something similar. So it's being decommissioned by a lot of airlines, including, for example, Lufthansa. So actually, fun fact, I know the one of the test pilot for the A380 was one of my friend's dads, was basically decommissioned because it's so expensive to run and economically not worth it. So actually we're kind of seeing it went too far the other way, really. It went from let's go all about speed to let's go all about efficiency, and it ended up being inefficient in economics terms, not in terms of engineering. Don't get me wrong on that one. But absolutely. What about you, Juan? What would you do?
So I think it's I would go with a similar answer as you. I would certainly try the experience, fly supersonic, check that from my to-do list or my bucket list, and then. But although I do see a use case for businesses and business travel. I'm a consultant. We travel a lot. If I have to be in the US for a week, right now that means that I have to stay over 2 or 3 weeks just to make the trip worth it, essentially. With supersonic flight, there might be a case where in 3-4 hours I can be in the US. I can do my work, I can do my interviews, my workshops, and then fly back home the same as I would do if I were working in a different country in Europe. So let's see. It is really going to come down to it. Always comes down to fundamental economics, and if they can make a model that works for businesses, and the upside that you get by shortening the flight by 2x, let's say, is worth the money. In other words, if they're able to provide a good value for money in the eyes of the consumer, then it will be a successful model. Otherwise, it may be another buzz bubble. It's just interesting that you bring up the A380 because it's exactly that. what happened again in that case, where it was just not economically viable. And the reason for that was because airlines really misjudged the market demand that was going to be, and in the end, it turned out that it was much harder to fill those massive planes with those first class cabins. The viability, economic, financial viability of the flight really depended on filling up the plane. And it turned out that airlines favored the hub and spoke model, where you get smaller aircraft, you designate a hub, and you route your flights through that hub. And again, it turned out that people prefer cheaper fares if they have to do one stop at one of the airport's hubs instead of paying for the full direct long-haul flight in an A380, which again is understandable.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that it's always a pendulum. Now, I always love using the pendulum analogy, because it's you go from one extreme to the other, and reality is usually always something in the middle.
Yeah.
Hopefully, it's
100%.
economically viable, but it'll be a bit like an Icarus situation where they try and keep going and keep going and keep going, and then eventually it won't be economically viable, and whichever one of those planes will be discontinued, and we'll either go back to those supersonics that are economically viable, or we'll realize, what, people loved it, like you and me, who probably, represent a huge amount of the population of, if my business is paying for it, who, by the way, are spending less and less on air travel, or I'll go for a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Those are sort of your demand areas. So you can quite quickly see that maybe there'd be a problem in demand even on supersonic. But it's not, it depends, right? I think it might not be the case. It might be that businesses actually do use it, especially for, let's say, a New York-London link to connect those two continents, or even parts of China with other parts of Southeast Asia. So we'll see. I think it's super exciting. Either way, I hoped to go in one soon, and maybe even with you, Juan. That would be fun.
Yeah. Man, we have to do it. If it comes back, let's set a challenge. Dan, when do you think we will get to, let's say, 1,000 subscribers on YouTube? Is that a big enough milestone to justify going on a supersonic flight?
I mean, if we get to 100,000, for sure.
Okay.
I mean,
then let's do that. If we get to 100,000 subscribers, Dan and I will fly on a supersonic flight.
Okay. So on that note, everybody, please pause the video and subscribe and like, and let's carry on.
Exactly. Okay, Dan, why don't we wrap it up? It's been a great conversation. Let's wrap it up with the usual 2 words of the week. So for anyone listening that doesn't know this, we tend to finish the episodes with our 2 words of the week, or 2 words of the episode. What are your 2 words, Dan?
So I think I'm going to cheat this week, because I like this phrase.
You always cheat.
No, I don't always cheat. So are you. So I was going to say quality over quantity. So something we've touched on is a massive AI project. We've talked about, the 500 billion. We've talked about DeepSeek. We've talked about using some analogies, right? Private equity, throwing money at things. I think this is a really important lesson, which is that sometimes instead of just throwing money at things or throwing resources, it can be your own time or anything. I think this is the more of a philosophical point. It's more about the quality of what you actually do with those resources that you have. I think that's my main takeaway, because 500 billion actually doesn't mean much to me if you're just going to throw out things at a wall and hope to see what things stay, right? DeepSeek has proven, despite it being a very, very different sort of project, that with quite limited resources, you can do quite a lot. And I think that's something that we can really learn, even for our personal lives. You, Juan?
Yeah, so I completely agree. My 2 words of the week would actually go quite in line with your response, which would be something like efficiency over scale. And it's just if you go back and listen to our first episode, one of the predictions that we made in that episode was that 2025 was the year of efficiency, that there had been a massive build out of AI infrastructure, and that 2025 was actually going to be the year where the focus was going to shift towards efficiency. And that was just really us thinking from first principles and saying, hey, we have already created models that have PhD level intelligence. People don't need more than PhD level intelligence for your day-to-day use cases. So there's going to be a shift towards efficiency and lower cost. And essentially what is going to happen is that intelligence is going to be commoditized. You're going to see more and more of these models come out open source that anyone can use for free, that are trained on distilled data from the parent models. And then the real value is going to be in the integration and the application layer. And that is why I am quite bullish on companies like Palantir and your AI application layer companies, because I think that is where the real value is going to be generated.
Absolutely. I think on that note, let me go buy some Palantir stocks. And I think we can call it a good week's episode. Thank you everybody for listening in. Follow us on our channels. Help us get to supersonic flight, or in other words, an ambitious 100,000 subscribers. And give us any comments or feedbacks or things you'd like to hear us talk about more. As always, Juan, thank you. This has been a really interesting session.
Yep. Great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, anyone listening. And bye-bye. See you next episode.
See you next episode.